Welcome to Policy Precision, our deep dive into the specifics and impacts of executive orders. I'm Ethan Caldwell.
And I'm Nora Harper.
Today we're dissecting the origins, the structure, and the initial actions of a really quite unique entity, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
Yeah, DOGE. We'll be looking into how this whole thing came about, its setup, and what it did right out of the gate based on some pretty interesting documents.
Exactly. Our sources for this deep dive include Wikipedia entries, plus official White House and Federal Register documents about DOGE's actual establishment.
And our mission really is to pull out the core of what these sources tell us about this whole initiative. Where do we even start?
Okay, so the beginnings.
Yeah.
It seems DOGE really emerged from talks between then-President-elect Donald Trump and Elon Musk. This was pretty soon after the election.
Right, and it sounds like it kicked off pretty informally, those meetings down at Mar-a-Lago.
That's what the sources suggest.
Musk was there. Vivek Ramaswamy, Howard Lutnick, Brad Smith, too, apparently. All part of those early chats. It's kind of amazing how big policy things can start like that.
It is. And then, fast forward to November 12th, President-elect Trump announces that Musk and Ramaswamy would lead this new Department of Government Efficiency.
And he compared it to the Manhattan Project.
He did. Quite a comparison, suggesting something huge and transformative.
Definitely sets expectations high, doesn't it? Comparing it to that. And Musk, well, he didn't seem shy about big ideas either. Proposing cutting down federal agencies from, 400?
Around 400, yes.
Yeah.
Down to just 99. His quote was reportedly, 99 is more than enough.
Wow. Memorable, I guess. And Ramaswamy was right there with him.
He was. Sources mention Ramaswamy talking about maybe even eliminating entire agencies and cutting the federal workforce by potentially 75%.
75%? That's massive, not just trimming around the edges.
No, definitely not. These were proposals for fundamental changes.
And didn't they write something together around then, like an op-ed?
Yes, they co-authored a piece in the Wall Street Journal, basically arguing for a smaller government, laying out the case publicly.
So they were really pushing this idea early on, setting the stage.
And then there's the acronym itself, DOGE.
Yeah, you can't really ignore that one.
It's hard not to connect it to Dogecoin, the cryptocurrency Musk has talked about a lot. It adds a slightly strange flavor to a government department, wouldn't you say?
It really does. Almost a bit. Internet-y. Which is, well, unusual for Washington, D.C. So, okay, informal chats, big announcements. How did it become official?
That happened via Executive Order 14158,
Mm.
signed on January 20th, 2025. So basically day one of the second Trump administration.
Okay, day one action. And the official purpose stated in the order.
It was framed as implementing the president's DOGE agenda. The method was modernizing federal tech and software, all aimed at maximizing efficiency and productivity.
So technology was the key, at least on paper, making government run better through better software.
That was the stated goal. The EO also laid out the structure. A key move was renaming the existing United States Digital Service, the USDS.
Ah, so they took something that was already there.
Exactly. It became the United States DOGE service, still abbreviated USDS, interestingly enough, and it sits within the executive office of the president.
Okay, so a rebrand and maybe a refocus of an existing unit. What else did the structure involve?
A crucial part was establishing the U.S. DOGE Service Temporary Organization within this new USDS.
Temporary.
Yes, explicitly temporary. It had a specific job: push forward the president's 18-month DOGE agenda, and it even had a termination date written in, July 4th, 2026.
July 4th, huh? Symbolic. So a sunset clause built right in. Who heads that?
The USDS administrator leads this temporary organization. It suggests a very focused, time-limited push.
It does. And it wasn't just a central body, right? Didn't they want people inside the agencies too?
Correct. The EO mandated DOGE teams within every federal agency. These teams needed at least 4 employees. Could include special government employees even. Agency heads would pick them, but in consultation with the USDS administrator.
So a joint effort between the agency and the central DOGE leadership. And these teams had specific roles.
They did. Typically a team lead, an engineer, an HR specialist, and an attorney. A mix of skills.
Seems designed to cover different angles: tech, personnel, legal. What were they supposed to do?
Their main job was coordinating with the central USDS and advising their own agency bosses on how to actually implement the president's DOGE agenda. Kind of like internal champions or Enforcers, maybe?
Points of contact, drivers within each department. Got it. And the EO gave the central USDS a lot of power to look under the hood, didn't it? Access to data and
Oh,
systems.
absolutely. It granted USDS full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems. That's pretty broad.
Full and prompt access to basically everything unclassified. That's huge. And it sounds like they expected some pushback.
It seems so. The order explicitly stated it overrides prior orders or regulations that might block that access, at least to the extent the president could amend them.
Clearing the path, basically. Removing potential roadblocks to getting that information.
Precisely. So the structure set up, the access is granted. Who are the main players running this?
Well, Amy Gleason was named the acting USDS administrator, and she reports directly to the White House chief of staff, so quite central.
Right. And what about Elon Musk? He was announced as a leader, but his official title was different.
That's right. The announcement said co-leader, but officially he was senior advisor to the president. But, and this is interesting, a court later determined he was effectively the leader of DOGE, exercising the administrator's authority de facto.
So the reality on the ground, or at least how the court saw it, was different from the org chart. Shows the difference between title and actual power.
Exactly. And there's also Steve Davis mentioned.
Yes. Sources report Steve Davis was involved in managing the day-to-day operations. It does create a bit of fuzziness around who was formally in charge versus who was actually calling the shots.
That ambiguity definitely became a point of discussion, even legal debate, as we just heard.
It raises accountability questions, for sure. And the sources also mention an informal nickname for many of the people working there.
Yes, the DOGE kids. This term reportedly refers to a lot of the young, sometimes less experienced software engineers the DOGE hired.
Which paints a picture, doesn't it? Maybe a different kind of workforce than you'd typically expect for a major government overhaul.
Right, maybe leaning heavily on new tech talent, but it also seems like the details weren't super clear initially.
That seems to be the case. The official structure wasn't published right away, and journalists apparently uncovered the identities of many members. It wasn't proactively announced by the government.
Yeah, that lack of initial transparency, that definitely became an issue later on.
Okay, so DOGE set up, people were in place. What was the core mission? What were they actually trying to do initially?
The headline goal was cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. Classic efficiency drive language.
Which ties into the broader goal of making government smaller, more efficient, cutting spending, reducing the workforce size?
Exactly. But there was another very specific focus, too, wasn't there, on DEI?
Yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion. DOGE was explicitly tasked with purging DEI initiatives and related personnel from federal agencies.
Which aligned with wider administration directives. This meant potentially getting rid of jobs and people whose roles were tied to DEI work, a really clear policy shift.
And given that broad access we talked about, DOGE had significant power.
Immense power, really. Access to almost all government data, the authority to shut down programs, delete data, even contact pretty much any federal employee directly. That's a lot of control in one place.
Including the judiciary, the sources mentioned. There were also reports about monitoring employees.
Yes, reports surfaced about using AI, artificial intelligence, in at least one agency to monitor employee communications, looking for anti-Trump or anti-Musk sentiment.
Which obviously raises huge questions about privacy and free speech for government workers.
Absolutely. And DOGE started publicizing its actions too, right? Trying to show results.
They did. Starting around mid-February 2025, they began posting these receipts on DOGE.gov, supposedly documenting contract terminations and savings.
Receipts. But there were issues with those claims pretty quickly. Accuracy questions.
Yes, significant questions were raised about whether the claim savings were real or verifiable.
And the examples of terminated contracts were pretty varied. Things like an NIH exhibit about Dr. Fauci, a DHS resilience program.
EPA contracts, HHS equity assessments, USDA climate programs, even leases for a former president's office and a USDA building. It cut across different areas.
And beyond contracts, there were other actions, like that spending limit on credit cards.
The smart pay cards, yes. A $1 spending limit was put in place for employees at several agencies.
$1. Imagine trying to do your job with that. That would have an immediate, very practical impact.
No doubt. And they also engaged with organizations like the National Gallery of Art, apparently about its tax-exempt status, suggests a broader look at government-linked entities.
And maybe the most ambitious thing mentioned early on was that plan for the Social Security Administration.
Rebuilding the entire SSA code base. That's a massive, incredibly complex undertaking.
Huge. and the potential impact on millions of people who rely on Social Security.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about Project 2025. That name often comes up in relation to DOGE.
The sources point to a promised close collaboration between DOGE and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. That partnership was seen as key for DOGE to work effectively within the government structure.
Right. And it seems DOGE's goals, its actions, they lined up pretty closely with what was outlined in Project 2025.
There appears to be significant alignment, yes. Project 2025 advocated for a lot of the same things DOGE started doing, targeting agencies for downsizing or elimination, for instance.
And doesn't Project 2025 also connect to that idea of the unitary executive theory?
It does. That theory emphasizes strong presidential control over the executive branch, which seems consistent with the centralized power given to DOGE. Understanding that link to Project 2025 helps put DOGE's actions into a potentially larger context.
It definitely does. Now, you can't have something this big and disruptive without stirring up controversy and opposition, and DOGE certainly did.
Indeed. Right from the start, its status as a temporary body raised questions. Accountability, transparency. Those were issues.
Especially since Musk was publicly saying it was transparent, while the administration was reportedly trying to shield it from some disclosure rules. Kind of a mixed message there.
And unsurprisingly, lawsuits followed. Quite a few, actually.
Yeah, and the criticism was strong. People warning about a constitutional crisis, some even comparing it to a coup d'etat. Very serious language.
Extremely strong language, reflecting deep concerns about DOGE's power and methods. There were also worries about conflicts of interest, weren't there, centered on Musk.
Definitely. Given his vast business empire, companies with government contracts, companies subject to federal regulation, the potential for conflicts was pretty obvious.
Raises legitimate questions about whose interests were being served. And what about those big savings DOGE claimed it was making?
Highly controversial. DOGE would announce these huge numbers, but then independent analyses would come out saying, hold on a minute.
Reports of billions in misaccounting inflated figures. One analysis even suggested the supposed savings actually cost taxpayers money in the end.
So the actual financial benefit was very much in dispute. And some critics accused DOGE of basically twisting the definition of fraud to fit a political agenda.
Rather than just focusing on standard fiscal mismanagement, the accusation was that they were targeting things they ideologically opposed and labeling it waste or fraud.
Which really questions the core motivation behind some cuts. Then there was the master database. That sounds alarming.
It does. Reports emerged about DOGE allegedly building a massive database of American citizens. The privacy implications there are, well, enormous.
A master database. That sets off all sorts of alarm bells about government surveillance and potential misuse of personal data.
Absolutely. Concerns about privacy and cybersecurity were rampant. It led to lawsuits citing the Privacy Act of 1974 because of DOGE's data access.
And the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, stepped in?
Yes, the GAO launched an audit specifically looking into DOGE's data handling practices, trying to assess if it was secure, if it was legal.
And it wasn't just outside critics, right? There was pushback from within, too.
Sources mention USDS employees actually resigning in protest over DOGE's actions and direction. Suggests some internal ethical concerns.
That's significant. When the people inside the organization start leaving in protest. And security experts were worried, too.
Yes. National security and cybersecurity professionals raised flags about the risks of integrating DOGE so quickly into critical systems, especially with reports of relying on less experienced staff, those DOGE kids.
So a really turbulent picture from the very beginning. Disruptive, controversial.
It seems so. So just to kind of wrap up our deep dive here, the Department of Government Efficiency was set up fast via executive order, ostensibly to boost efficiency and modernize government tech.
Right. But it was built on an existing service, rebranded, and given temporary but really significant power and access across the entire federal government.
And while the focus was supposedly tech, its initial actions were heavily geared towards cutting costs, shrinking the workforce, and specifically dismantling DEI initiatives.
All happening amid major debates about how it operated, how transparent it really was, and what the long-term effects might be on how government works, and on citizens' rights and privacy.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. When you see these large-scale top-down initiatives like DOGE established so quickly with such a broad mandate, what are the potential unforeseen consequences? How might they impact the stability and effectiveness of government and ultimately the lives of the people it's supposed to serve?